Action Hour, I'm speaking with the Executive Director of the Whidbey and Camano Land Trust, Ryan Elting. Ryan has 20 years of experience in natural resources management, land protection, and conservation program management. Prior to joining the Land Trust, he directed longleaf pine forest protection and restoration programs for the North Carolina chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Ryan earned his BS in biology and environmental studies at Tufts University and Masters of Environmental Management from the Nicholas School of the Environment and Earth Sciences at Duke University. He and his wife, Marta, have a small farm in Freeland with their daughters, Alma and Eliza. We're here to talk about conservation easements. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for being here. Sorry, I totally was just like, let's just get into the conversation. But thank you for taking the time. I asked you on because I wanted to talk about conservation easements, mostly because I don't understand them. And I assume if I don't, that other people also don't understand them. But I also wanted to kind of start by asking, what is a land trust? Because I think that's also kind of something that unless you're in the know, you may not understand why they exist and what the deal is with that. So,
yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on here. I appreciate it. I love your podcast. I've learned a lot from them also. So it's an honor to be invited. So land trusts. Land trusts we're nonprofit organizations. We work to conserve the land by acquiring property or conservation easements, which we're going to talk about, working with willing landowners. So we only work with willing landowners. And the goal is to protect forests and farmlands and other important landscapes and ecosystems for future generations. Grassroots land trusts like Whidbey Camano Land Trust, as opposed to sort of the big nationwide conservation outfits like the Nature Conservancy and Trust for Public Land, we tend to work on a smaller local geographic scale. We're relying on community support and partnership with the community. And being small and non-governmental, we can be really nimble in protecting land and partnering with landowners and communities to ensure that the land remains protected forever.
Are there like specific, I just want to go into this. Are there specific parameters that you look for when you're looking to work with landowners? Like if any landowner has land and they want to donate it, can they? What's kind of the limits? What are the limits?
We have a conservation plan that was developed, initially all the way back around 2003 to 2004, with input from the community and from natural resource experts, and that initially identified kind of the land protection priority areas that we tend to focus our work within. Those focus areas are sort of they represent sort of concentrations of various conservation targets that we're looking at, like just, intact forest land or intact coastlines or large areas of viable farmlands. So just some examples. We've also, since then, established conservation corridors. So wild, intact areas of the landscape that wildlife will be able to move through, and also, plants will be able to disperse through, as the climate changes, if they are protected and remain intact. So we use the maps the conservation priorities that are outlined in our plan to dictate, where we focus our kind of proactive efforts. Landowners do come to us, and they're sometimes inside those priority areas and conservation corridors, and sometimes they're nearby or don't fit well within them. And so, we do look at every single opportunity that comes our way, whether we've, when people come to us and put that through our process so that we can score it and determine whether it's something we're going to pursue.
Yeah. And how do conservation easements kind of fit into this schema, and what is a conservation easement?
The land trust protects land really in sort of two primary ways. We purchase and acquire land in fee that we manage as preserves. And examples of that are, Trillium Community Forest, our Keystone Preserve. A variation on that are lands that we protect and we facilitate for partners like Island County in the case of Barnum Point County Park over on Camano. So land trust, we don't have the staff and the volunteer power to manage and steward, all of the lands that really need to be protected, under our conservation plan. And so conservation easements are a really important tool to be able to protect more land than we can or really should own and be managing. So conservation easements they're voluntary legal agreements that are placed on a piece of land. The agreement is between the landowner, that private landowner, and a qualified organization like the land trust or government agencies as well. And the easements permanently limit certain uses on the property with the goal of protecting the conservation values. So the important things, there's some important things like the landowner, the land remains in private ownership. The landowner is retaining the property, but they're agreeing to restrictions that preserve its natural character. And those restrictions are permanent. They run with the title of the property from owner to owner. So land can be sold, inherited, what have you. The conservation easement stays with the land forever. And so it's really important that you take the time and get it right. But they are flexible and they're specifically created for each individual property. It's not just a template that we're using. The terms of the easement are really catered to that property.
Yeah. When we first talked about this, you mentioned that because you said it changes the use of the land, and we talked about it in terms of best and highest use. And
yeah.
I think that's very interesting because I think that societally we think of the best and highest use of any piece of land as development, right? Like if you're in a development mindset, that's the best and highest use of the land. And so I'm curious, how does a conservation easement change the value proposition of what the best and highest use of land is?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, highest and best use, that's an appraisal term. It doesn't imply, I think, what you and I,
it's not philosophical in nature. Yeah.
the loftiest and most beneficial use of a property, what highest and best use refers to is, what is what's the likely use of the property that's going to yield the buyer the most monetary, value when they sell it. Pretty much what it comes down to. And typically in Island County, the highest and best use is going to be residential development on 5 to 10 acre lots, whatever the zoning for that property is. So maybe sometimes 20 acres. Now, interestingly, I think that the conservation easement, so by removing the currency of these conservation easements is removing residential development rights from these properties, and perhaps timber value if you're going to limit the amount of timber and protect the forest from being clear cut. So placing those restrictions on the property are gonna reset that highest and best use to something more like we want it and the landowners want it to be, which is providing those conservation benefits and the ecosystem functions they provide.
How does that change? I mean, does it change the monetary valuation of a property?
Well, yeah. I mean, if the highest and best use, right now for a piece of property is, to be broken up into 5 or 10 acre parcels and sold as individual residential lots. Removing those development rights is going to change the value of the property. So we're kind of getting into the appraisal side of it now, which is interesting.
Yeah. And I'm curious about that. I know I had other questions in between, but I am kind of curious, like, how does the easement appraisal process work? How does zoning factor into that process? What does, what would it look like for a landowner to go through this process? And then, I mean, you and I on this call, we value conservation. So that's a reason to do it alone. But why do people do this? Conservation
easements can be purchased or donated. So that's, there's incentives for placing easements on property. If you donate it, kind of depending on your income level, there can be pretty significant tax incentives, federal income tax incentives, and also state tax incentives. And if you're selling the property, you don't get those tax benefits, but you get the direct value of the conservation easement. So those are incentives for different landowners, and the appraisal process is an interesting one. There's kind of only a relatively small subset of appraisers who are qualified to do conservation easement appraisals. They don't look anything like a kind of bank appraisal that you might get if you were trying to buy a house or something like that. I mean, these are a hefty size of a book kind of appraisal, and really it's sort of two appraisals wrapped into one. They're also probably, costs around $8,000 to $15,000, depending on how complex the easement is. So, it's like I said, it's really two appraisals wrapped into one. The first thing they're going to look at is what is the value of the property right now, unencumbered by the conservation easement. If it was just going to be sold in an arm's length transaction, the first thing they have to do is establish what is that highest and best use. Again, in Island County, it's typically residential development. So they're looking at, how many lots might this property likely be split into, and what's the value based on comparable sales of properties, close by and in the recent past. And any adjustments that might need to be made on those comparable sales to determine what is the value right now. They call that the before value, before the easement is in place. So there's kind of the first analysis that happens. Next, they're going to look at the property as if it was encumbered by this conservation easement, as if this easement were hypothetically being placed on the property. So we already have to have the basic terms of the easement, established when the appraiser is starting to do their analysis. And so then they've got to find a whole new set of comparable sales based on properties that are, that are similar in their if there's no ability to build more residences on that property, if you can't cut the timber, then and those are harder comparables to find, and they probably take more adjustments. But if they're going to look at what is the new highest and best use that is created by that easement being put in place, and that's going to establish the what they call the after value of the property. So you've got that before value if it were going to be sold right now, that after value if you were going to try to sell that property with this easement on it, and the difference in that is going to be the value impact of placing that conservation easement on it. So that's what the landowner is either going to claim to the IRS if they're doing a donated easement, or what are going to be the basis of what we'd be paying that landowner if we're purchasing the easement.
I'm curious. You said that people can donate easements. When that happens, who then owns the land?
Yeah, really important concept is that the landowner, whether it's being the easement is being sold or donated, the landowner continues to own and manage that property,
Right.
based on the terms that are set in that conservation easement.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's sold or donated, it's still privately owned, privately managed. The role of the land trust is to work with those landowners throughout time, as it changes hands, and monitor it at least annually to make sure that the terms of the easement are being upheld. And we have the responsibility to enforce the terms of the easement if they're not being upheld. So,
if it's you guys are kind of like auditors and enforcement officers for easements, as well as conservation partners for landowners.
Yes, exactly. We're coordinating with, right now, 84, 85 individual property owners each year to go out, visit their property. These are usually really wonderful visits, and and our staff and volunteers love doing them. Get to see these properties that, they're not open to the public. They're not preserves. They're privately owned properties with conservation easements on them. And typically those landowners are fully bought into those easements and managing their properties beautifully for those conservation values. But if there's, and sometimes it's not even the owner that might cause a violation. You can have neighbors doing a timber trespass, things like that. And the land trust is able to, bring resources to the table to help enforce that. We have an insurance policy on every property that we own or have a conservation easement on, and we have legal defense insurance so that if there are violations or problems, we can make sure that we're adequately defending the properties and not setting bad precedent and case law for conservation easements.
Yeah, that's great. So it really feels like it's a pretty tight-knit partnership between a land trust and private landowners in order to facilitate and keep going a conservation easement. I'm curious, do you think that people who choose to put their land under conservation easements, it seems like you have to be a pretty serious steward of the land in order for it to make sense to do that? Yeah.
Again, people have, various incentives for doing it. But typically they're coming into it, with a conservation mindset and understanding, the important conservation values of their property to start with. Whether it can be adequately stewarded and maintained, plays into the land trust's ability and willingness to actually conserve it in the first place. If a property is not going to be able to be adequately stewarded, into the future, then, we might be hesitant to get into that relationship, of course. But most folks are already good stewards of their property. And again, they want to protect those values. And so that's always a good relationship. The tricky part is, the next landowner or two landowners down the line may not have the same intentions or stewardship capacity that the original grantor of the easement did. And those can be trickier relationships, but we're working pretty proactively as conservation easement properties change hands so that folks understand what they're getting into, and we're trying to avoid those conflicts before they arise.
Yeah, that makes me wonder, in terms of the flexibility around creating an easement in the first place, and I'm curious, what kind of property would someone end up inheriting right? Like if you sell a piece of land, is it because like part of the property has a conservation easement and another part of it, I don't know, has a residential home on it? Is that how like how, or do people, end up? Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, how does the next buyer end up with a conservation easement typically, or in your experience?
Yeah, each one is unique. Like, we think we're going into it and it's going to be similar to this other conservation easement that we did. And it's always, there's always new challenges. But, so some properties, most properties that we're placing conservation easements on are going to have, an existing home or, or have retained the right to put, at least one home on. Otherwise, who's going to be that, owner in the future? Who's going to want to own a big piece of forest land with no ability to live there and manage it? So we, we typically try to incorporate at least one, residential home site, either existing or retained, in a conservation easement, unless we think we want to end up owning that property down the road, because otherwise it gets very challenging to find the appropriate next owner or buyer. What folks are typically inheriting or purchasing is a larger property, probably anywhere between kind of typically 20 and 50 acres, with at least one home site that's available on it. And we try to kind of carve out that building envelope, we call it, so that, we don't have to be monitoring and dictating, how people are managing their house and their lawn area. We don't want to have anything to do with that. That's kind of county planning's purview. So the goal of the easement is to protect, that forest land or that farmland, or those wetlands and intact coastlines.
Yeah. And so when you're drawing up a conservation easement based on the fact that, you're trying to create this envelope, how does zoning factor into the appraisal process? And when the best and highest use changes, does the zoning also change?
Right. Yeah. Good question. So definitely that gets right to the highest and best use, like you said. So a conservation easement is going to change the highest and best use of the property because it's removing residential development rights and placing other restrictions on the property. So the zoning, though, is a completely separate, overlay by the county, and it doesn't change. But the conservation easement will prevent the property from being subdivided and developed.
So even if it's like
so the zoning may say that you can have a house on every 5 acres, but the conservation easement is going to say you can only have one house on this 50 acres.
Okay, great. So that's how they interact, is kind of the best and highest use of the property based on the easement, actually trumps the zoning as it pertains to that particular parcel.
That's absolutely true. And the assessor then is going to look at the impact of that conservation easement when they are assessing the taxes on that property from there on out. So a conservation easement can reduce your county property taxes, but it does not necessarily do that, because if you still have the right to to live in that house or build a house out there, then there's still significant value attached to the property.
In terms of economic value and benefit, the way that we think about it, the appraisal process, as you've described it, is pretty specific, right? It's like you're appraising the property based on, certain rules, and it's dictating, the best and highest use and what the value of that property is based on other properties of a similar type. But from a more broad perspective, I think that, conservation, in this time of climate disaster and, loss of biodiversity and deforestation and, the erosion of our shorelines, there's a question of like, what is the broader societal economic value of conservation? Like for an individual landowner who is a steward of their land, they're invested in a way of life and they're invested in conservation values. But I think also their conservation of their land has a broader ecological health impact for like all of us, right? Like if a landowner down the street decides to put a conservation easement on their property, I benefit from that indirectly, right? Like, that's my perception of that. And I think because it's harder to see or harder to measure, I think for the average person that it's, I'm just wondering what you think about that, what you would say to that point.
Yeah, it's really hard to kind of measure, the value of something that's not changing, and you see it really clearly when that clear cut happens and the runoff, is, impacting your own land use, and you don't think about it so much when the forest is standing there and, absorbing carbon dioxide and helping the clean water infiltrate into the aquifer for our drinking water.
Yeah.
And so there's, we're on islands here, and we're completely reliant on the ecological services that the land is providing for us. Chief among them being aquifer recharge.
Yes.
So we're benefiting from each of these forests that is kept standing and providing fresh air and providing habitat for all of the pollinators that are, helping our food crops, to produce. So, there's a real tangible benefit in that way that doesn't get captured in the conservation easement appraisals in any way, but is helping us to be more resilient on these islands, with climate change, on us.
Yeah. I'm wondering if there's, to that point of talking about measuring and how it's hard to measure, what continues to exist. I'm wondering if you have any stories of people putting their land under conservation easement where, you've like seen a change or an impact, like a positive impact to the ecosystem of that property.
I guess one thing I'd say is, we've had conservation easements, donated conservation easements that were the first step in huge conservation projects that we've ended up undertaking. I mean, for instance, the Lagoon Point Community Forest that we've been working on for past 4 years, that started with a fella donating a conservation easement on his beautiful little, 50-acre farm at the north end of this project area, and us going out, identifying, the neighboring properties that were potentially for sale, looking at the bigger area and identifying the opportunity for trail networks, and, turned into what's going to be a 275-acre community forest with community trails that were, in kind of the later stages of that project. So, I mean, and not only that, but the fellow wanted to be anonymous, but but he was just a conservation hero, and his property is incredible and will benefit from the additional, conservation work that's happening next door. There's lots of other examples too, and
you can think about it, but that's a really good one, just because it shows that, a conservation easement or like the action. I think of leading it by example as kind of the, he set the stage for the possibility for this larger acquisition, for this, this like larger project, just by identifying and donating what he had to offer.
Another great example is the Christopherson Farm and Forest over on Camano Island.
Oh, so, yes.
It's just a phenomenal place, and sort of probably like the most iconic property on Camano Island. I mean, everybody goes on and off the island is driving past Christopherson Farm. And it's just an amazing place, and it has so much conservation value and community benefit. So, the family had already done so much work, voluntary work, to restore and improve the habitat on that property. They've got a beautiful lake that's at the headwaters of Christopherson Creek, which is one of the only, salmon-bearing streams on Camano Island, and a lot of conservation effort and funding has gone into expanding that salmon habitat. Well, they've been working from the headwaters down on their property, and Island County has just put in the final fish-bearing culvert across the highway there. So it's all connected now. And Christopherson Farm, it's protecting the whole forest. It's a working forest, so they can continue to sustainably harvest timber. Their management plan has them managing timber to 180 years, and with small harvests about every 20 years. And the farmland continues to be, productive, in a place where the community can come together. Great agricultural related events that they have out there. So Christopherson Farm is a super example of folks who obviously had an amazing conservation mindset and wanted to make sure that property continues to function and provide those community benefits.
Yeah. And also, I love that because it's like part of, in that story, it kind of showcases the connection between a property and, the function of an ecosystem, like, the life cycle of salmon. That like the recognition that the property you own and the where you are, that you're part of this larger network that has to function in order for the ecosystem to function, in order for the species to continue to thrive. And so I love that. That's a great story.
One other example is the Price Sculpture Garden up in Coopville. So, Scott and Karen Price placed a conservation easement on that property. And that was a completely unique easement that allowed for a public sculpture garden in it. So again, only one easement like that. There's a lot of examples, and that's been just such a popular, wonderful place.
Yeah, that's a really cool one. I'm wondering, is there a relationship between conservation easements and the public benefit rating system?
Oh yeah. To get the full score, the full possible tax benefits under the public benefit rating system, a conservation easement, needs to be in place. I mean, what you need is you need to have a important resource like the forest or the farmland or the shoreline, I guess. You need to have a conservation easement that permanently protects that. And then you need to have some public access or tangible public benefit, and that's just to get the full points that give you the greatest tax benefit under that system.
Cool. All right. So moving on to what the land trust is up to now, I kind of wanted to, in addition to talking about conservation easements, I also just kind of wanted to talk about what you all are working on. You mentioned your conservation plan at the beginning of the episode, but I was just curious, basics. How many acres of land does the land trust currently protect? And, like how many ecosystems? What does the land trust determine? How do you determine interest? Like we kind of talked about that up top, but in terms of your priorities, what is it that you're working on now? What is it that where are you headed? What are you protecting now?
Yeah. That's a lot of questions in one.
Sorry.
I can just go through those. So I think at this point we've protected 11,554 acres.
Wow.
So, most of that in the past 20 years, and the ecosystems you asked about, we're sort of looking at, we call them conservation targets in our conservation plan. Mm-hmm. And, those are really farmland, forest land, tidelands, wetlands.
Yeah.
And so we've protected, about a couple thousand acres of farmland, 5,000 acres of forest land, 3,500 acres of tidelands. So that's an interesting one. We own 3,500 acres over in Livingston Bay. It's adjacent to another 5,000 acres that the Nature Conservancy owns.
Oh, cool.
So those are lands that are flooded twice a day. But, that kind of conservation ownership allows for sort of cohesive management and dealing with invasive species like that Spartina grass, and can help kind of facilitate future restoration work on the shoreline there.
You answered the first question, which was like, what are you currently protecting? What ecosystems?
Yeah.
And then I think what I asked was where you headed. But before we get into that, I'm curious about how restoration factors into management of properties. Like when you acquire a property, do you what's your assessment for what the needs are for that property to kind of reach its, healthiest?
Mm-hmm. Are you talking about lands that we own then?
Like lands that you own, and then when you're basically when you're assessing what you already have, and then when you're going out and you're I'm interested in this property, I imagine that sometimes there's kind of a lot of restoration work that has to happen. I'm thinking of the prairie on Keystone, right? How it's there's you've isolated 5 acres of prairie, or maybe it's more than 5, but I think I remember there's at least 5 acres of prairie.
The prairie soils are still there, and we're undertaking a restoration project to restore, to recover that old prairie.
Yeah, but you had to do, I guess, you had to analyze the soil to know that there was prairie soil there. So I'm kind of just wondering how you all go about that process.
Yeah. So I guess I want to say, under our conservation plan, emphasizes kind of, expanding and buffering and connecting, properties, protected properties. And so, we're always looking at, working out from what's already been done, or connecting together functionally connecting together, work that's already been done, because, that's going to help your ability to restore, what needs to be restored. If it's, if it's large enough and if it's connected, you're starting from a better point. So, where we're going, I think it's critical that we're protecting the kind of last large blocks of intact forest land that are on these islands, for the reasons we've already talked about. And so that's a big focus of the land trust right now. And then, within that, so we're talking about unbroken forest, but within those big blocks of forest, there's various qualities of habitat, I would say. And so, we're looking at, first of all, protecting large blocks and then restoring portions of it that need work. So, that kind of restoration work looks like you might have seen out at Trillium community forest, where we're very carefully, selectively thinning that to get it down to, what could eventually move it in an old growth, trajectory. And that's been incredibly successful. So when we're looking at a place like Keystone, for example, we always thought that was going to be hopefully a conservation easement property. But when it went on the market to regional developers, we had to look at, the only option for us was to purchase the property at that point. And so, we took a deep dive into the conservation values out there, and, what is our vision for, improving the health out there, because that was a heavily used property. There was a lot of forest land that was cut over that needs enhancement or restoration work. Our stewardship specialist, Kyle, identified those prairie soils, and that was that was an exciting discovery to see that we've got these prairie soils that are the same as in the heart of Eby's Reserve and Eby's Prairie that could be restored to something like they formerly were. There was ditched streams out there that we've now restored back to their kind of original their original course, and are working on actually about 16 acres of bluff top and riparian restoration out there. There was shoreline that was hard armored, that was holding up the old beach house out there. And, to even have access to the grant funds to purchase Keystone, we knew that, removing that house and that bulkhead was going to be critical for improving the shoreline function and the nearshore marine habitats, like the eelgrass beds and the kelp forests that are out there. So, it's that's kind of, Keystone is a pretty extreme example of all the things that are going on out there. But to some extent, that's happening for every property that we look at acquiring.
With the bulkhead on that property, has it been removed yet?
Yeah. As of last fall, there's no more bulkhead out there. We've still got, we're still working on putting in the stone staircase to get the public down to that 2/3 of a mile of beach at Keystone. But most of the work is done at this point.
Cool. That's exciting. That's, a big deal. I was thinking about it because I heard or I was talking to someone about how Evergreen is removing their bulkhead from their shoreline, and how they're doing a project to study how long it takes the habitat to come back and in what ways. And I was wondering if you guys are going to be monitoring that too, to see what happens, right? You've removed the bulkhead. You're going to work on restoring it. And then, I'm just wondering, do you guys monitor stuff like that?
Absolutely. Yeah. We're very carefully photo monitoring it, and, so that we can observe over time. And we've taken the drone flights over it so that we can really show, how that bluff responds and how long it takes for it to revegetate. We can identify whether we need to step in and do some planting in there, or whether it's going to kind of self-stabilize, and is that going to be with native plants or with invasives? Because we need to be ready to deal with that. We're always monitoring, and that 16 acres of plantings, that's like 16,000 plants that are being planted. We're going to be,
that's incredible,
monitoring the survival of those plants over time. We got to water them. We got to supplement it if there's mortality. But we've got a good program in place to do all that we use kind of across our preserves where we're doing restoration work.
That's great. You mentioned Trillium Community Forest, and I went through the forest like just after the select cut happened with Nathaniel Talbot. He did a woods walk for our group, but he had met with Kyle prior to kind of walk him through how that process went. And I think it's interesting because I'm new to conservation and to ecology, but I guess when I first moved to the island, I didn't realize that so many of the forests that we see are not at all natural because of the way that they were replanted, and they were replanted a lot of the times way too close together. And that actually when you see like true old growth forest or legacy forests, there's a lot more room between trees because they're not meant to be that close together, I guess naturally. And so I'm kind of wondering, was that, how did you guys determine to do that select cut? And in terms of the vision for what it's going to look like in the future, I don't know if you could kind of go into that a little bit. I'd appreciate it.
Well, Trillium was another one of those emergency acquisitions, happened before I was here. Definitely helped shape the way the land trust is working. And, huge community effort and pulling together to make the acquisition of Trillium possible, square mile of forest, pretty amazing. And then, as soon as that, sort of the acquisition phase of that project was closing out, we were looking at the management plan, the forest management plan for that. Had numerous community sessions to help determine the uses of the property, and also looking specifically at the restoration work on that forest, because like you said, there was 420 acres I think that was clear cut in the 80s and was replanted, and I think it's common practice for it to be it's intentionally planted densely with the expectation that it's going to have some thinning, some mortality, and then some pre-commercial thinning before they get into that sort of clear-cut cycle. That wasn't what happened at Trillium. It was replanted 600 trees per acre, which is 4 times the density that it would that we're trying to get it to now. And so we worked with some consultants, the Janicki Logging Company, and developed a plan, over 10, 15 years to get it down to a more reasonable density, we took it from 600 trees per acre down to 300 trees per acre, around 2010 to 2012 or 14. And then now we're in that second and final cycle of going in there to take it from, 300 trees down to, 150 or even 120 trees per acre there, and start to approximate, a mature forest. A real old growth forest is going to have even less than that. You might have significantly less trees than that per acre, but we wanted to do it in phases to let the forest adjust. Now that we're getting through the second cycle, we'll be done with that next year. We're working on supplementing underplanting with more diversity of species to make it a more resilient and structurally diverse forest with different age classes and lots of different species to enhance the wildlife habitat.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because it's just trying to model what it would look like if we hadn't disturbed it is an interesting strategy. Yeah,
that brings up a really interesting point, that I think is really important. A lot of land, a lot of the impacts that we've had on the land are not just gonna resolve themselves. We've had such a heavy hand, and the ecology can't just recover without some help by us, actually. So, that 600 trees per acre, like Trillium was, that's just a tinderbox that's going to go up in flames. It provides no wildlife benefits. There's no understory under something like that. And eventually it's just going to, that kind of forest is going to die and be replaced with invasive species. And so, you have to actively take steps to move it back in the right direction. We've built a really strong stewardship program that, we're able to identify those issues and really help rectify them.
That's great. I love that. Yeah, it is. I think it makes sense that we would have to, in terms of restoration work, right? That the concept of restoration is that there was disturbance, and that, largely most of the time, 99.9% of the time, it's because humans did something there, to that kind of altered the course of nature. And so correcting that course, or course correction, I think makes a lot of sense in terms of conservation management. What else? What other projects are on the horizon that you think people should know about?
Yeah. This Lagoon Point Community Forest that I mentioned before up in Greenbank is an exciting one. We've made a lot of progress. Over the next couple of years, we're going to have that 275 acres protected and be looking at creating the trailhead access to the property. That's an exciting one. And we'll definitely be doing some forest health enhancement work out there. So more opportunities for people to come see what that looks like. We're working on a new community forest called Holmes Harbor Community Forest that we partnered with Wien on to fundraise for a piece of property that on East Harbor Road that was on the market. That Holmes Harbor Community Forest that area is the largest block of intact forest in Island County that's left. And, there's already been a lot of work that's happened out there over a long period of time. There was 360 acres protected before we sort of came into this new phase of turning that into a community forest. Several conservation easements, some trust lands that are held by Island County there. Now we're looking, like I talked about with our conservation plan, buffering out from that, connecting it together, and creating that balance of, protecting the habitat and providing some, appropriate public access out there, trail systems. So we think that could be 1,000 acres of intact protected forest, potentially more, but, we're really diving into it, piece by piece right now and trying to connect that together in a coherent, manageable block of forest.
That's really exciting. I mean, both of those projects I think are very exciting. And I think that, forest protection, as we talked about earlier, the ecosystem services that forests provide us are, in this numerable and in this moment, maybe immeasurable, but can be overstated how much for the forest land does for us in terms of our aquifer recharge, in terms of, carbon sequestration, in terms of just, habitat for all kinds of wildlife. And it's something that we have here, right? We still have forests to protect. And so I think I'm so happy that the Land Trust is involved in that. And I love that you've mentioned with, both the the property up in, or the project up in Greenbank and also Holmes Harbor, that private landowners and their conservation easements are a part of the strategy that is allowing you all to get to the point of large scale connective conservation. The fact that people have conserved their land on their own is contributing to that contiguous habitat that you all are then able to come in and do a larger, potentially a much larger conservation effort around. So I love that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's exciting work. And then, the farmland protection is a whole other side of it too. And trying to make sure that we've got a viable, agricultural system out here in the future, that there's farmland that can actually be managed to produce, to have a sustainable food system out here is pretty critical. So, that's another avenue that we've, there's some new tools that we can use there to buy and buy farmland that's on the market so that it doesn't get subdivided and developed, put a conservation easement, and then actually sell that at an affordable rate to newer farmers. So that's something that's really
that's really cool.
Yeah. Something that we've been doing more of and have lots of opportunities to do in the coming years.
I think that's really critical. I mean, our food system is, vital. Our agricultural community is really strong here. We have a lot of really passionate farmers who are committed to contributing to the food system of our islands. And Arctic gave a presentation with Wien and Island Roots Housing for the Planning Commission a few weeks ago. And one of the critical things that Danielle Bishop emphasized at the beginning of her presentation was how farmers are coming up against land costs versus, what produce sells for, what their product rather sells for. And the rising land costs for farmers makes the barrier to entry really difficult. And so if there is a conservation easement on a property and you can sell to someone who's getting into the business at a more affordable rate, that creates sustainability for our agricultural industry, which, a lot of older farmers have said that they feel like their only option is to sell to a developer because they're land rich and maybe cash poor.
And I want to give credit where it's due. I mean, we're taking advantage of some state programs that the conservation community has helped develop over time. So a lot of work's gone into that, and now we're just starting to see the fruits of it.
How does conservation impact affordable housing?
The land trust is typically working, out in the county in rurally zoned areas. And that's not typically where affordable housing, has ever traditionally been able to be located. So whenever we're working kind of even close to or adjacent to the incorporated areas, we are looking very carefully at whether a conservation project is going to take away affordable housing opportunities. And we're working very proactively with the affordable housing providers to look at those opportunities and make sure that we're not unnecessarily, missing chances to create affordable housing. And I think there's real opportunities for win-wins there, to carve out areas where affordable housing is possible and makes sense, and protect the conservation values on where there are critical areas and important ecosystem functions that need to be protected. So we're making sure that on any projects that come along that have conservation potential, we're not preventing affordable housing.
That's great. Is it possible, in the flexibility of a conservation easement as a private landowner, is it possible to would it be possible to create a conservation easement on a property that specifically designates the residential envelope to affordable housing or something like that? Is that possible?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the simplest way is just to identify where affordable housing would work on a piece of property and carve that out of the conservation easement and just preserve that future opportunity. Mm-hmm. We're also interested in opportunities where, we can protect a property and get the developable area of it into an affordable housing provider's, hands to be able to do their work. But at least we don't want to preclude affordable housing where it would work.
I love that. I think often we think of conservation and affordable housing to maybe be at opposite ends of a conversation. But I think in our community and on Whidbey Island, we have a community, that is really sensitive to the needs, affordable housing needs of our community, and also sensitive to ecosystem functioning and habitat and conservation. And so I believe that there's, in our planning process for the next 20 years and beyond, that our community will find ways to find creative solutions that do both.
Well, I mean, just as you're talking about it, I can see that there's an environmental justice aspect to it. I mean, the folks who are, the workforce housing, who are living in the workforce housing and need the affordable housing, also deserve the same conservation benefits as we're able to provide in the more rural areas. So I think, there is a real benefit to having, a protected land around, a cluster of workforce housing as well.
Yeah, I think about this a lot as it pertains to urban ecosystem functioning and how we do or do not think about the ecosystems in urban areas, and even just the access to park space that, if we're not planning in a way that is thoughtful, we could put people into complete concrete jungles that have no access to trees or nature or anything like that, which, that studies have shown that impacts well-being in a negative way. And it also, I always think about how urban populations are the first to experience ecosystem degradation. And from an environmental justice standpoint, Absolutely. I think it is really important to think about, are we providing conservation values to all of our community members? Are we providing affordable housing to all of our community members? How can we be more equitable when we're thinking about these things? It's not, conservation isn't just for the people, or it shouldn't be just for the people who can afford to conserve 50 acres of land, right? It needs to be for everyone. And yeah.
Well, I mean, conservation easement can even create opportunities for affordable housing, because just like we were talking about before, the conservation easement is, removing value, removing rights and value from the property, and that can make it affordable. So we're reaching out and working really proactively with the municipalities to identify those places that are critical for the community's growth, and then places that are really more appropriate for open space and conservation, so that we're able to help implement the community's goals.
That's really cool. So I guess just a couple more questions before we close out. Where should the public visit? What Whidbey Camano Land Trust lands do you think people should go and walk around and hang out and visit?
Well, one that I think, maybe not a lot of people know about, and this is a really unique one because, it's called our Walking EVs Trail Network. It's trails on these are trails on a whole bunch of private conservation easement properties that connect together, a lot of other protected lands and trail networks, and gets folks into part of the of EB's reserve that you just don't normally see. And so I think you can go up to like our Admiralty Inlet Preserve that's also open to the public, and from there get on the Walking EB's trail network and get all the way over to Rhododendron Park and follow those trails into Coupeville. That's a really exciting one that people are loving. And it's unique because typically conservation easements don't create public access, but we were able to get these affirmative trail easements through the conservation easements and connect them all together to create this bigger network. So go check out Walking EB's. If you're on the north end of Whidbey, you should go to our Strawberry Point Preserve. Beautiful forest land and meadows up there with trails that are open to the public. If you're over on Camano Island, or even if you haven't been to Camano, you need to go over and see Barnum Point County Park that we helped develop for Island County. That is just an absolute gem, and it's worth a trip over there. And all these places, all the lands that are open to the public or otherwise protected are on our website on the interactive map on our website. So www.wclt.org, WhidbeyCamanoLandTrust.org, and you can see all the places that you can go and hike and visit.
And then I guess last question, how can our community get involved with the Land Trust? If people are interested in being involved with Whidbey Camano Land Trust, what are the ways they can plug in? Yeah,
thanks for asking. We do lots of volunteer work parties. So if you want to get out on the land and, there's beach cleanups, there's trail building, there's planting parties for, as part of our restoration work. Lots of opportunities to get out and volunteer, or even, if you prefer to hang out and stuff envelopes in the office, we'd love to have you here. But, you can sign up for our e-news and get info on our tours that are available, because we do lots of tours out at Keystone, out at Strawberry Point, all over the island. And we're getting more and more school classrooms out onto the properties, visiting as well. So your kids will be coming home and talking to you about some of these places. And then, of course, help keep the island conservation strong and become a member of the Land Trust. Then you get our newsletters and all the updates. So lots of ways to get involved.
Cool.
Thanks for having me on, Amanda. I appreciate it. And this has been fun.
Another man up in the pulpit in the State House. Head of the table with a black pen, scratching egos, talking too loud. Externalize every outcome, every warm gun, every profit. And kneeling down to the flashing numbers, the NASDAQ, the cold constructs. Running backwards to just keep moving, just keep moving, just keep moving. Unlearning every lesson that our mothers tried to teach us.
This podcast is a production of the Whidbey Environmental Action Network and is made possible by our generous donors. Produced, edited, and mixed by me, Amanda Bullis. Special thanks to Marianne and Steve for their years of service through action and for lending their voices to this podcast. To WEEN's Executive Director, Marnie Jackson, and our board for their leadership. Special thanks to Whidbey musician and WEEN board member, Nathaniel Talbot, for letting us use his track, Intuition, from the album Animal, available on Bandcamp. Every day on your paycheck, a volume of confidence against the idea of your body being put into your own hands. So please don't hold it, please don't hold it, please don't hold it back. Unleash the power
now ain't that old religion or the cold hard facts. Just need a woman's intuition, get us on track. Just need a woman's intuition, get us on track. Stepping out of the shadow of a false man's allegory, slowly erasing that old violence from the story. Recoupling emotion, slow motion to intelligence, granting the planters, healers, teachers, feelers a new relevance. What I need now